Hello, I'm Jonasz Rewiński and you're watching TVP World Talks. This year's Munich Security Conference is taking place at a pivotal time in global politics, with one of the dominant themes being the gradual demise of the old world order. The old world is gone, US State Secretary Marco Rubio told reporters before attending the summit, a message seemingly echoed in a speech delivered by German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, although from a rather different angle. So does Europe have what it takes to adapt to this changing environment, and can it do so without damaging the Transatlantic alliance? Joining us here today is Scott Lucas, Professor of American Studies at University College Dublin. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Thank you so much for having me here.
So, US State Secretary Marco Rubio is still delivering his speech at the Munich Security Conference. So, may I ask you, if you have been following that one live, for a quick comment on what he said so far?
I am frustrated. I'm infuriated. Not because I'm pro or anti-Trump or pro or anti the United States, but albeit with some nicer phrases at times. For example, a shared destiny with Europe. Marco Rubio effectively lectured the Munich Security Conference to say, you do what the Trump administration wants you to do, or else we will have no international order. If you break down what he said, he effectively said that the current UN has no role in the world, that current multilateral organizations like NATO are not operating the way the Trump people want it to do. He distorted recent history to say that it was the fault of Europe and international organizations that Russia had invaded Ukraine, that Israel had attacked Gaza for 2 years after Hamas had carried out a mass killing.
Did he mention that specifically? Did he mention that specifically?
Yeah,
he did say that the world order needs reform. He also said that the UN has potential, but has to change to adapt to it. But was there also a message of conditionality? Is that the way that we should construe this speech when it comes to Europe and the transatlantic relations?
What he effectively did is he lectured not just Europe, but the world, that says, look, you do it the way we want to. So, for example, when he talked about Israel and Gaza, ignoring the mass killing in Gaza, he said, oh, it was the Trump administration that brought about the ceasefire. Now, in fact, the situation is far more complicated in Gaza than that. We can go into that. When he went to Ukraine, he said, oh, it was America that brought the two sides to the table, the current talks between Ukraine, Russia, and the United States, ignoring the fact that the Trump people threatened the survival of Ukraine by at one point cutting off all assistance, cutting off all intelligence sharing, and actually cooperating with the Kremlin to give an ultimatum to Kyiv. So in other words, get beyond the glossy words on the top of this, and then let's go to the wider point regarding Europe. What he effectively did was use the anti-immigrant message to push the idea that Europe had to, in effect, pursue what you might call white nationalist policies. He said, in effect, you must pursue the complete crackdown on immigration using the racial and even the religious terms. Notice how often he referred to Christianity, which are the same terms used by hard right parties. And let's connect the dots here. Marco Rubio might be nicer than J.D. Vance in terms of the rhetoric he used, but the U.S. national security strategy in December made it clear they are going to support white nationalist parties, so-called Christian parties in Europe, and they are going to undermine the European Union. That is in that document, and nothing Rubio today changes that. In fact, I think it reinforces it.
Do you think that this really is the message, though? I mean, obviously, white nationalism is one of the most odious ideologies out there. In its undiluted form, it can lead to riots and violence. Nevertheless, wouldn't it be a bit of a stretch to assume that this is what the US wants to do? Marco Rubio did mention, obviously, the influence on the cohesion of societies and the roots of the European culture, as it were, and by extension the American one also. But wasn't this simply an appeal to go back to these roots and re-establish what made these societies powerful, without the need to reject? After all, he did mention that, you know, the American society was formed by immigrants from Europe, obviously, without the need to necessarily reject anything that happened after all, after that, but to perhaps limit certain, as he was referring to, like foolish policies. Foolish was the word that he would often use in that speech. So essentially, once again, calling for reform instead of the outright abolition of many achievements of Western culture of tolerance as we see it today.
Well, let's speak specifically about immigration and then the wider point about Europe. And by the way, I speak as an immigrant. I was an immigrant to the United Kingdom. I was an immigrant to Ireland. And the fact here is that what Rubio was saying there was not, let's have a sensible discussion, as Europe has been having, the European Union, and as many countries have been having, about what we do with the surge in immigration that has taken place because of instability, disasters, wars across Africa, across Central Asia, in the Middle East. He's not saying let's have that sensible discussion. He's just simply saying, that's it. All immigrants are bad. And in fact, if you look at what he did not refer to in the United States, is that the United States is in the wave of a crackdown on immigrants, refugees, and asylum seekers, which violates U.S. law, violates international law, and has led to widespread violence such as we saw in Minnesota. That's the impact that you want to talk about, although he will not refer to it. Now, let's talk about the wider point in Europe. If you think that this is just an innocent discussion about immigration and dealing with immigration, think about who J.D. Vance met after his speech, his destructive speech last year at the Munich Security Conference. It wasn't the mainstream governments of European nations. It was Germany's AfD. Think about where Marco Rubio is going immediately after this conference, to see Viktor Orban, Hungary's Viktor Orban, who has pursued some of these xenophobic policies, but who also, by the way, is probably the most friendly leader within the EU towards Vladimir Putin. So get beyond the immediate speech and look at the signals that the Trump people are putting out, which is effectively, when they say we don't believe in the world order, and you put it well at the top, they mean it in the sense of we don't believe in the cooperation that has been developed since 1945. We want to do it a far different way on our terms. And if you don't accept those terms, we will reject you. That's very different when Friedrich Merz says, let's repair and rebuild what we have had since 1945. And those two different visions are the different visions that Europe has to make a choice between. Not a few months or years from now. They have to make that decision now.
So let's talk about the elephant in the room that you've already mentioned, namely relations with Russia and the question of the war in Ukraine. Now, these signals have indeed been controversial. We've had President Trump saying that Zelensky needs to make a move, once again claiming that Russia wants to make a deal, despite the available evidence to the contrary, some could say. Where do you think is it likely to lead? Do you think that Ukraine will be coerced into making a deal that will not benefit the Ukrainian people and instead may result in further Russian aggression? And can European allies actually exert some influence there, perhaps advance ideas that will slightly decrease the impact of this particular way of thinking, which in some cases seems to favor cooperation between the great powers, in this case Russia and the US?
Well, let's look at the facts as we know them right now. And you quite rightly pointed out that Donald Trump put out the false statement yesterday that it's only Russia that appears to want to make a deal, when in fact it's the Kremlin that continues to pursue its maximum demands for Ukraine's capitulation. Let's look at the fact that Marco Rubio skipped a meeting of European leaders yesterday which discussed Ukraine, effectively undermining that meeting. Let's talk about the fact that as we go into the third set of Ukraine-Russia-US talks next week, that Donald Trump's envoys, a real estate developer named Steve Witkoff, and his son-in-law Jared Kushner, have effectively told Ukraine, look, if you want security guarantees, you have to give up all of the Donetsk region in eastern Ukraine, this very strategic reason. Let's talk about the fact that the Kremlin continues to try to use the lever with the Trump camp of joint U.S.-Russian projects. In other words, sanctions removed, and then the U.S. and Russia, not Ukraine, pursuing trillions of dollars in potential investments which, by the way, would benefit Donald Trump and his inner circle. You put all of that together, and Europe has to be on guard, as Friedrich Merz said yesterday, as Emmanuel Macron said yesterday, as other leaders like Alexander Stubb of Finland said yesterday. There are those in the United States, those who work within NATO, who work within the State Department, who work within the intelligence services, who still believe in Ukraine and Europe's security. And that's why Ukraine has not been forced by the U.S. completely to surrender, but it is Europe that will have to continue to provide the bulk of the assistance. And it is Europe that will have to talk about Ukraine's place in, yes, a meaningful international order, even as the United States tries to walk away from it.
So a quick question now. How should Europe approach the Trump administration and American politics in general? We've been hearing reports already that the Democrats will be trying to encourage Europe to stand on its own, to actually oppose certain policies. But wouldn't this go a bit too far in becoming involved in US domestic politics and essentially having Europe taking sides there, which could be of benefit if there is a Democrat winning the next elections, but it could also potentially backfire. Do you think that Europe should maintain a rather more reserved stance, such as that presented by, for example, the NATO Secretary General?
Even as the Trump camp interfere in Europe's elections, the endorsement of Viktor Orban, the promotion of the Reform Party in the UK, trying to undermine its Labour government, and numerous other examples I can give you, you're absolutely right that European interference in U.S. elections is exactly the wrong thing that should be done at this point. Instead, Europe needs to lead by example. Look, I think a lot of us agree that, irrespective of Trump, Europe needed to do more for its own security. Europe needed to do more to address issues like immigration, and has done so in recent years. And Europe needs to continue to do so. You have to hope for the best. Without interfering in the U.S., you have to hope that there's a more sensible government in place. But until that more sensible government is in place, you have to take care of your own home. And you have to take care of your own home by defending those who are under attack, whether they're under attack militarily by Russia, or whether they're under attack in terms of rhetoric and sometimes action by those who used to be our ally back in Washington.
Professor Scott Lucas was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your insight.
Thank you.
And I'm Jonasz Rewiński. You're watching TVP World. Please stay with us.